Come with me.
You're listening to the Alchemical Tech Revolution, and I am your host, Wayne McRoy. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we're going to take a look back at Tavistock's war against the public. If many of you may not be familiar with the Tavistock Institute, or the beginnings of the Tavistock Institute and what they've become in this world. Basically, this is one of the major places or organizations, I should say. It's not just a place. Its reach goes far beyond what the actual physical location actually encompasses. But what this organization has become, it's become a primary social engineering hub of the world. So that being the case, we're going to get into a little bit of the origins and some of the developments that happened within the Tavistock Institute and how many of these things came about to give people a sort of education as to why the world's in the shape that it is and how this whole thing is organized and orchestrated from various central groups, and Tavistock being at the heart of this. So we're going to get into that tonight, and this will kind of be a continuation of the show we did on the Quiet War against humanity. So this will kind of lay the groundwork for people and connect some of the dots between that previous episode. If you haven't listened to that one, give it a listen. That one we discussed the document Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. And we can see how the quiet war machine has stood against the public at large by this small group of elites that kind of run things in this world. And tonight we're going to expose a little bit of the foundations of how Tavistock got its grubby little fingers into everything and has been able to manipulate the masses in some concerning ways. So we'll get right into it here. And tonight we'll be primarily reading from The Campaigner magazine, the April 1974 edition. So this is an older source document here. And we're going to read an article within it called Low Intensity Operations, The Reesian Theory of War by M. Minicino. Okay? And this will discuss one of the major founders and major players of Tavistock, Mr. John Rawlings Rees. If you're not familiar with that name, look it up. This guy is implicit in much of the social engineering that's gone on in the world. And he was a psychologist who really used the things and methods that he learned to manipulate the masses. And you know, they make no bones about the fact that he used it for the purpose of manipulation, right? And these are the people that set up this Tavistock Institute and all of the different working groups from Tavistock that go off of it. And we'll see. I mean, the connections will be drawn here as we read through the article. And I will give, some of my, my own opinions on things as we go through here. Excuse me. Let's get into it. Introduction. With the discovery and extensive deprogramming of Christopher White during the first week of this year, going to pause, that'll be 1974, folks. The labor committees picked up the threads of a conspiracy against the working class, led by the Rockefeller faction of international capital and using the techniques developed by Dr. John Rawlings Rees of the Tavistock Clinic in Britain. Since that time, the labor committees internationally have been primarily engaged in exposing the capabilities and extent of this network and in building the working class forces necessary for its systematic destruction. To refuse to completely neutralize this network, which is in this period the conspiratorial vanguard of capitalist fighting forces, is to ensure the final defeat of the working class. And I'm going to pause there, folks. Now, since the writing of this article, way back in 1974, we could just judge by the state of affairs today. That's not what has been going on. They weren't trying to take apart this whole conspiratorial organization here, right? They weren't trying to do that. Either that, or maybe there were some good people, I'm sure there probably were, that were trying to do so, but, the power structure has firmly ingratiated itself within various roles throughout government and quasi-government organizations and have allowed it to continue. And that's exactly what's going on today, all right? They're working feverishly to destroy the middle class, see? And that's primarily one of the main goals of this whole operation that's been going on, the destruction of the middle class. Because the middle class is a threat to the power balance for these people in positions of control See, what they're aiming for is a type of neo-feudalism. So that being the case, a middle class kind of puts a buffer zone there between the ruling class and the ruled class. And they can't have that. So, it's much easier to control just a 2-bit system rather than a 3-bit system, so to say. So that being the case, that's why they want to eliminate this middle class. But let's continue on here. This network is designed fundamentally to maintain class rule to whatever level of viciousness demanded by capitalist economic necessity by means of mass persuasive techniques capable of the irreversible destruction of the creativity of the working class and the reshaping of workers' behavior into the appropriate machine-like patterns without the development of new ideological forms such as fascism. Since the 1930s, John Rees and the small circle of psychiatrists around him with Rockefeller money had consciously developed that capability, and by 1946 had sold literally that capability and the growing network to implement it to the Rockefeller faction of American capital. Gonna pause there. Always these same couple big names come up, don't they? Rockefeller, all the same ones. Rothschild, Rockefeller. The big money. Everybody knows where the big money is. And these people always have their hands in a lot of this stuff. That's where the financing comes from, and that's where, ultimately the planning goes on, is through groups that kind of hover around these big money interests. So that being the case, we see here, this John Rawlings Rees, in the 1930s, established himself within the psychiatric field and surrounded himself with various people to get this whole thing rolling, right? So to say. But let's read on, and we'll see what kind of influence and, the methodologies that have come about since this whole thing has kind of taken on. So, the Tavistock Network and the Reesian method. That the class war should be waged with weapons, it says in quotation marks, that affect morale more than they take life. Gonna pause there. Silent weapons, folks. Remember what we discussed in the Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars document back in the episode on the Quiet War? Let's read on. So, weapons that affect morale more than they take life has become, in the post-war period, the primary weapons system of the Rockefeller forces, including their own covert arm, the Central Intelligence Agency. With the recognition of the beginning of a capitalist breakdown cycle, the Rockefeller CIA faction has mobilized the Rees network along with all its other forces to implement rates of accumulation, at least on the order of those implemented by Nazi finance minister Hjalmar Schacht globally under direct military rule. That is the capitalist economy necessity. There will be no ideological cover like Hitlerism to soften the horrors of direct military takeover in the advanced capitalist sector, for it is believed that if the psychological onslaught that Rees has prescribed is successful, then none will be necessary. It is, in part, for this reason that the Rockefeller CIA and the Rees network have spent over 30 years completely reshaping capitalist armies to make them capable of such naked rule, knowing that it is, finally, quote, the armed body of men, end quote, upon which class rule depends, and realizing that someday such armies would have to exercise their true function openly. And I'm going to pause right there, folks, so we could see here how we've been set up to be manipulated, okay? It's a psychological warfare operation going on, right? From this ruling class against the rest of us, against the public. That's what they're doing because they don't want like a armed insurrection or something like that going on. They don't want to have those kind of challenges. They don't want to have to operate in a militaristic type fashion. So they were firmly convinced from the works of Rees and others and some of his predecessors that it's possible to steer public opinion and steer public consciousness in a way to which they outright just accept the way things are, and then they don't have to come to blows with something like this, right? They don't have to use militaristic force to to push this neo-feudalistic system that they want in place. People will just readily accept it. And that's the whole point of this. That's what they're doing. They were conditioning people to accept this type of a paradigm. Let's read on. The Rockefeller forces, because they have made the Reesian method and network the major portion of their arsenal, must now be fully committed to that method and network if they are to survive in much the same way a section of German capital had to move, with the unpleasant contingency of Hitlerism, if it was to obtain necessary economic measures proposed by the former Weimar banker Schacht. Unlike Hitlerism, Reesian methods rely completely and consciously on the destruction of the mental life of world society and a forced march into universal sadism. And from this, there can be no further contingency. And I'm going to pause there, folks. Let me repeat that. Reesian methods rely completely and consciously on the destruction of the mental life of world society and a forced march into universal sadism. What's going on in the world today, folks? What are we seeing? We've been largely seeing the destruction, the categoric destruction of the human mind and the depravity of society into this universal sadism, haven't we? We've been seeing this. This is a social engineering operation going on. This did not come about by accident. It's not coincidence. These people have been manipulating things using various methods that the whole of society, or the vast majority of society, I should say, are unaware of. Okay, they use methods that the vast majority of society do not understand and are unaware of. And we'll get a little bit more into that here. But you could also see how it makes claims back to Germany, World War II Germany, right? It's the same controlling factions running things, okay? It's where the Germans failed. Well, these guys learned the lessons where the Germans failed and are trying to do things slightly differently. So they've learned from the mistakes, and they've adjusted on the fly and been able to pull off these certain things. So we could see just by our observations today just how far along in this social engineering campaign it's come, and we'll get a little bit more into that later as to what the specific belief system of John Rawlings Rees and some of these other power brokers that do the social engineering on a grand scale. We'll see what their belief systems are and how they've engineered certain things into society here. Let's read on. Our purpose here is to expose the development of the Reesian method, the formation of the Tavistock network, and its takeover of the British armed forces, the complete deployment of the Tavistock network, and the story of the full utilization of it by the Rockefeller forces and their CIA is demonstrated elsewhere. Since the war, the British military, under the direction of the Tavistock network and the CIA, have been in the forefront of refining the Reesian theory of war, for years known as quote-unquote counterinsurgency, and are now using these refinements to bring fascist military rule to England. As we shall show, under Rees, counterinsurgency became not a fight against insurgents, but a testing ground for new forms of institutionalized psychological control at the behest of the Rockefellers. The most advanced of these forms, now known by the more appropriate, more positive title, low-intensity operations, is now being brought home to Western Europe and North America. And I'm going to pause right there, folks. And remember, this was written in 1974. 1974. These people play the long game. We see that. This stuff was well underway in the 1970s. Probably, at least 40 years underway within the 1970s. Bare minimum. And actually, this whole social engineering campaign's been going on for much longer than that. But it's just this specific power group, this specific network came into being in the 1930s and was able to establish itself and set itself up to become one of the main bastions of social engineering of the whole world in that time frame. And moving forward through the decades, it's had many successes. And these good folks here at the Campaigner magazine apparently were trying to expose this back in the 1970s. And guess what? A lot of this stuff, not commonly known by too many people. But it's out there. It's all public domain now. You could find it. It's just not many people took this stuff seriously back then. They thought it was all wacky, quote-unquote, conspiracy theory, right? Much like people do today. But we're looking around and we're seeing the real-world effects of this social engineering campaign going on today still. Here we are in 2022, and this is absolutely gone on in the past several decades and is still going on today. And we'll see as we get a little further through the article here. Many of these same methodologies are still being used today and used very successfully. And, we'll get more into some of the other aspects of this as we go along. But let's pick up where we left off. The shaping of John Rees. The genesis of John Rawlings Rees's ideas and his motivation for building the Tavistock network was, like Hitler's, not profound. It would be an injustice to even say that such ideas sprang from some perversion of the science of psychology, in spite of the fact that Rees would use the psychological profession to build his conspiracy. Rees's sociology never transcended the gutter variety peddled by the turn-of-the-century academic apologists for British imperialism, who had gained a short period of hegemony at universities like Cambridge, where Rees had studied. These men had sought to justify English colonialism with weird mixtures of scientific fact and inane 18th century stereotype, claiming, in short, that it was quote-unquote genetically necessary that sturdy English stock rule over the congenitally helpless darker races. Such theories, like eugenics and other so-called race sciences, had dropped out of academic prominence by the 1930s, but were kept alive somewhat artificially by the Nazi theoreticians and the numerous ruling class sympathizers of the British fascist Sir Oswald Mosley. And I'm going to pause right there, folks. Eugenics. It's an active eugenics program going on today. This is what it's about. This is what it's always been about. Race. Why do you think race is a hot topic issue today when if you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s, I had thought in my personal experience that this whole racist mentality was something that had largely been done away with, primarily in Western society here. It really wasn't an issue the way that they try to push it today. Now, there's always these pockets of where you have some of this racist mentality going on, and there's always those types of people that have that kind of ideology, but largely it didn't really seem to be a hot topic issue like it's been made out to be within the past several years now. So, once again, I mean, a lot of this draws back to these eugenics-based ideas, okay? This is why they keep reviving the whole race card issue or the whole racist type issue. Racism. It's why institutional racism is always brought back up. Whenever they need to socially engineer the masses in a certain way, this is one of their go-to points that they stick with. Okay, it's right in the playbook. Right here, it's what we're talking about. It all has to do with eugenics, and it all has to do with the attitudes of these quote-unquote elites. Okay, and we'll get there. Let's continue reading on so you can see a little more what I'm talking about. In 1945, in the fullest single statement of his worldview presented in his book, The Shaping of Psychiatry by War, Rees indicates that he had not dropped this pseudo-scientific racialism to which he had been exposed. Rather, he had made it fundamental. Society, states Rees in 1945, is composed of layers, starting at the bottom with a psychopathological tenth of the population, which is constitutionally inferior, with the rest of the layers differentiated functionally by increasing levels of talent and lack of neurosis. This bottom neurotic tenth is made up of what Rees calls simply dullards, and includes, unfortunately, a large percentage of the colored population. Gonna pause there, folks. This is what Rees believed. This is what the people that he associated with believed. This is largely what many of the people still in charge in this elitist power structure still to this day believe, and it's all based on eugenics ideas, okay? foundationally flawed eugenics ideas. But yet, these are the people who have power in this world. So the things they believe will affect us all. And this is why, still to this day, we have the whole racial issue going on. Because it's a eugenics push by these elitists. Understand? Let's continue to read on now. And this is a quote from Rees here underneath. It goes on after that last sentence. Rees quotes from Aldous Huxley's book, so let's read that. Aldous Huxley, in his book The Brave New World, was planning to produce a section of subnormal men who would do the dull jobs of the community. We really don't need to produce them, for there are too many already. So, let's continue on. Obviously, such beliefs had nothing to do with the psychiatric methods that Rees would study after his service as a medical officer in the First World War. Our problem is that Rees used his understanding of psychiatric methods to formulate and implement an action program based upon such beliefs. The task of psychiatry, if it is to be practical for Rees, is the, quote, proper allocation of skills, unquote. Psychiatrists, he suggests, are capable of determining the neurotic map of each national sector and, based on this study, can set up a filtering mechanism to select out the various neurotic types and place them in their appropriate skill. With such selection techniques, dullards, who are only frustrated because of their consistent failure, can be channeled into simple tasks and the happy fellowship of other dullards. Those who are capable of the highest intellectual functions will be allowed to do so unencumbered with inferior types, a truly happy mental life for society. It should be noted that even Rees's broad psychosocial theories were not terribly new. Since the pre-World War I period, capitalists, particularly the Americans, had understood that if more profit was to be had from the new modes of production of the 20th century, then progressive reforms, which capital could then afford, had to be used to upgrade the standard of living of the working class. However, it was quickly realized that the promise of such reforms could easily let loose revolutionary potential within the working class, and therefore such initiatives would have to be tightly controlled. The Rockefellers and the Fords particularly became masters at the controlled development of the new working class, mobilizing and funding a number of scientific initiatives for their purposes. This process was not unknown to many Marxist theorists of the period. The Italian communist Antonio Gramsci, reflecting on the ravages against the American worker caused by the methods of one of these Ford and Rockefeller-funded scientists, the speed-up specialist Frederick Taylor, claimed that the very purpose of American society had become, quote, developing in the worker to the highest degree automatic mechanical attitudes, breaking up the old psychophysical nexus of qualified professional work, which demands a certain active participation of intelligence, fantasy, and initiative on the part of the worker, and reducing productive operations exclusively to the mechanical, physical aspect. But these things, in reality, are not original nor novel. They represent simply the most recent phase of a long process which began with the industrialism itself. This phase is more intense than preceding phases, and manifests itself in more brutal forms. A forced selection will ineluctably take place. A part of the old working class will be pitilessly eliminated from the world of labor and perhaps from the world. End quote. Did you catch that last part? A part of the old working class will be pitilessly eliminated from the world of labor and perhaps from the world. So, that, folks, right there gives you a little bit of the intent behind some of the things that have gone on here, what this is about. And I'm talking primarily about, this is about the destruction of the middle class, right? Well, it's more than that. It's also a depopulation program, too, isn't it? It's always dual use with these eugenicists, and that's what they are, eugenicists. So, see, they're thinking of people in terms of, well, you're just dumb. You're a dumb animal. We could use you to do physical labor. And that's your lot in life. And when you're no longer needed, you'll be disposed of properly. That's how they think of you. That's why they refer to you as, quote-unquote, human resources. Understand? That's what this is about. This is the ideology that's taken hold throughout many of these social engineering organizations throughout the world, and the controllers thereof. Okay, these are the people that set policy. These are the policy makers in this world, folks. These are the people that make very real decisions on things that happen in this world. These are the ones that manipulate economies, manipulate people on a massive scale, convince people to do things which are absolutely unreasonable, but yet they do them. Look at the past 2 years, what's gone on. Look at what they've done, what they've convinced people to do, and without having a violent uprising. This is what John Rawlings Rees was all about. Socially engineering the masses into capitulation for this, without so much as a whimper. That's what's been going on, okay? They don't need to use militaristic force if they control your mind, if they attack your mind. And that's exactly what they've done, and that's what's been going on. And this is the full-blown rollout of what's called the Quiet War. World War III, folks, has been going on since 1954. 1954. We're in the heart of World War III, still. Here we are, almost 70 years later. It's been going on. Make no mistake about it. Understand. This truly is World War III, and we've been living through it all of our lives without even knowing about it. It's the nature of the beast. It's the quiet war. We don't know that it's going on, but it has an indelible effect on us, doesn't it? And this is exactly why. They learned during World War II that it's really messy to have a militaristic operation like that to try to bring about these same things, and they get resistance. It gets messy and expensive and destroys valuable infrastructure. See, they don't want that. So they would much rather engineer our minds to accept and capitulate to these ideas and just willingly march along like sheep to the slaughter. And that's what society's been doing. Make no mistake, this is World War III, folks. We're living through it right now. We've been for a long time. We haven't realized it. And, there's very few people out there sounding the alarm about this. Some people are speaking up and saying a lot of these things, they don't make sense, and they're speaking out about different aspects of it. But this is the whole deal, folks. Like, this is how they do things. They've been manipulating the consciousness of men for a long time now. And that's how they're getting things done. By attacking your mental state. And it's said here, right in the outset of this article here, that was the stated goal. That was Rees's stated goal, and they've adopted many of this guy's ideas and onboarded them for social engineering. But let's continue reading. It has been demonstrated elsewhere that the Rockefeller family took the lead in fostering the growth of such selection procedures, particularly in the so-called child guidance and industrial health movements. There must have been a fairly deep collaboration between Rees and the Rockefeller Foundation in this area by the 1930s. What Rees developed over and above the other scientific collaborators of Rockefeller was the logical organizational correlative of his bestialized psychological practice. And this is him, I'm quoting him, quote, "If we propose to come out into the open," he said to a group of U.S. Army psychiatrists in 1945, "and to attack the social and national problems of our day, then we must have shock troops, and these cannot be provided by psychiatry based wholly in institutions. We must have mobile teams of psychiatrists who are free to move around and make contacts with such a local situation in their particular area," end quote. Rees's logic is tortured but clear. For true mental health, there must be a complete transformation of society along the lines of rational selection. Unfortunately, many don't see reality this way, including most workers who believe that any method of selection is a mechanism by which the wicked capitalist aims to get more work out of the worker, and that argument dies hard. In the Reesian worldview, such naysayers, along with anyone who engages in strikes or subversive activity, are themselves neurotic, desperately in need of treatment, but unfortunately unable to see they are ill. And I'm going to pause there, folks. Do you hear that? Do you hear the implication here? If you don't buy lock, stock, and barrel the quote-unquote official narrative of things, you're mentally ill. They see you as mentally ill and that you need treatment. But the unfortunate thing is you don't realize you're mentally ill. But they'll give you treatment anyway, won't they? That is the attitude of these people in control right now. That's been the attitude for a long time. If you object to the things that they're doing, they will label you as mentally ill, and we'll see in later broadcasts that I do how this is an alarming trend in and of itself. The fact that they could label you as being mentally ill and then take away some of your, basic human rights and offer you, quote unquote, what they call treatment when it's not really treatment, right? It's all about trying to collectivize you in a sense, make you listen to what it is they want, make you fall in line with everybody else. You capitulate to their demands. That's what it's about. But anyway, I don't want to, harbor too long on that. We still got quite a bit of reading to go. Let's continue on here. In such a world of unwitting neurotics, psychiatry, the only arbiter of sanity, can be exercised only by a cabal in every country, groups of psychiatrists linked to each other, prepared to muster all their weapons and influence for a move into the political and governmental field. Only a conspiracy of psychiatrists, as Rees meant when he spoke of his mission, could build a society where it is possible for people of every social group to have treatment when they need it, even when they do not wish it, without the necessity to invoke the law. Gonna pause there. Did you hear that? Let me read that statement for you again, because this is absolutely what they've been up to and what's coming for us. Right? Let me read that again. Rees meant when he spoke of his mission, he could build a society where it is possible for people of every social group to have treatment when they need it, even when they do not wish it, without the necessity to invoke the law. Sound familiar? It's been going on in one way, shape, or form for a while now. And we're not just talking about psychological treatment, folks. Think about it. What have they done the past 2 years? What's the big thing? You have to have a vaccine to get in here, don't you? You need this vaccine pass. You can't come in here unless you're wearing a mask and you take this vaccine, right? We can't serve you. Do you see what's going on? That's all part of your quote-unquote health, right? And that's all part of this as well. That's all part of the psychology involved with this. You need to have the treatment, whether you wish it or not. And if you don't want it, we'll try everything in our power to coerce you to get it. And even if you don't capitulate then we'll force you. We'll outright force you. What have they done? They've threatened people's jobs and livelihoods to do this thing, haven't they? And guess what? It hasn't really worked out as effectively for them as they would have liked. But a vast, huge, massive number of people did capitulate to this. And that's the sad part, folks, because we're seeing blowback for it now. And we're going to continue to see some really ill effects to this whole thing in upcoming years. And, that's part of the test. So the next phase would be forcing people to get psychological evaluations and things of that nature, right? And we've seen some of this to a certain degree, haven't we? So, but let's continue on here, and I find it very telling some of the terminology that the author of this article is using. The construction of that cabal became what Rees himself would call his lifelong mission. It should thus be clear that Rees's view of psychiatry is itself essentially uninvolved with actual psychiatric method of therapy. The Reesian worldview is, in fact, no different from that of the psychopathological bourgeois, desperately in need of a magical handle with which to manipulate the terrifying forces of the outside world. Rees's not-so-fundamental discovery was, crudely put, that psychiatric methods could be reversed, to the effect that techniques used to liberate the mind from the parasite of psychosis could be used to induce controllable forms of neurotic or psychotic behavior. And I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to repeat that for you, folks. I'm going to repeat that. This is crucial. Understand this. Okay? Let me read that again. Rees's not-so-fundamental discovery was, crudely put, that psychiatric methods could be reversed to the effect that techniques used to liberate the mind from the parasite of psychosis could be used to induce controllable forms of neurotic or psychotic behavior. They're talking here about inducing psychotic and neurotic behavior in people, folks. They're talking about induced mental illness. Induced mental illness. Look at our society today. We have never had a time when we've had more mental illness than we do now. And it's been done on purpose. And there are other aspects of this that go right along with that, too. And I mean, I'm not talking just straight up what people would consider like psychosis or neurosis or things of that nature. That's a very broad term used here. Okay? There's other things that have been engineered into our society. Conditions like autism, folks. I've written a book on autism and how it relates to the transhumanist philosophy and how it's been induced into society. And I'm currently working on a second book tackling these same objectives. So we'll see. I mean, as we go further into study on these things, what's been done. But here it is. This is an admission right here of what's been going on in this world for at least the past 70 years. Probably longer than that. Likely a lot longer than that. But they're talking here. Rees's ideology was to produce mental illness in people so that controllable forms of mental illness. Do you understand the implications of this? Do you understand what's been done to your mind, to your family, to society with these methodologies? These are dangerous people, these social controllers, these social engineers that work from places like Tavistock and other of these policy think tank groups. These are the ones manipulating people, steering them in certain directions, controlling society. Okay? All the stuff you see going on in the world today, it's all been engineered that way. There's no such thing as coincidence. There's no such thing as accidents. All this nonsense going on with Russia right now, all contrived, all manipulated, all put together for a reason. All engineered for a reason. Regardless of what you think the truth is behind all of that, I accept that there's very real destruction and chaos and everything going on over there. But you need to understand, regardless of whether you believe it's all just for show and it's all fake, or if there's, a lot of real things going on over there, it's been engineered, folks. It's been crafted that way for a reason, okay? So regardless of what your stance is on that whole thing, understand there's a reason it's been implemented the way that it has. And it has to do with a lot of these same methodologies and reasonings that have been adopted from John Rawlings Rees and the Tavistock Center, right? So let's read on. The history of the Tavistock Network details Rees's overwhelming need to manipulate. Even before Rees had fully articulated conspiratorial theory, the evidence of his neurosis is rich. In the early 1930s, he flexed his growing powers in psychological manipulation to obtain his first coup, the directorship of the Tavistock Clinic. Hugh Crichton Miller, the founder of the Tavistock Clinic in 1921, and the doctor who taught the young Rees psychiatry, had, by 1931, become too resistant to Rees's ideas about practical psychiatry. In retaliation, Rees started a rumor campaign throughout the younger doctors at the clinic about Crichton Miller's methods until the staff was calling Crichton Miller a butcher to his face. In 1932, the older doctor had a breakdown and was unanimously replaced as medical director by John Rees. Gonna pause there, folks. This guy was an absolute nut job. These people in positions of power, these elitists running things today, they are psychopaths. Understand that. They don't think like a regular human being. They are psychopaths. They are sociopaths and psychopaths, and they only put people in different positions of power that have these same traits as themselves. And they view the rest of us as being the quote-unquote mentally ill here, right? We see that. We see what's been going on. They're narcissists. They're control freaks. They want to be gods of this place. And they do that by manipulating others, and they have... They gain great pleasure from manipulating and controlling people. And they see you as little more than a resource. Okay? They don't have concerns or morality like you and I do. These people that are controlling things are the true psychopaths of this world. All right? When you understand that, then you begin to see what this is about. And this John Rawlings Rees guy, this was some of the foundational things to his thinking. And he set himself and his buddies and all of these elitist power brokers in this world into position to be able to socially manipulate society in a grand way. See? And we'll get to that. Let's read on here. To cement his hold over the clinic in preparation for the changes he would make, Rees introduced collectivism, demanding that publications by staff members had to be collectively approved, and at one point that the physicians actually pool their salaries. This from a man who readily stated that his view of socialism had not changed appreciably since his service as the chief medical officer for the British Army anti-Bolshevik expedition to Baku after the First World War. And I'm going to pause there, folks. There's a huge number of points to be made in this last paragraph alone. Okay? Rees introduced the idea of collectivism. Where have we heard that before? Collectivism. Okay? Collectivism into the Tavistock Clinic. And he demanded that publications by staff members had to be collectively approved. Listen to that. Do you know what that is, folks? That's the birth of the almighty peer review method. Who came up with that? This psychopath from Tavistock. That's why you get nothing but flawed science out of all these big institutions, right? All of these think tank groups. The almighty peer review. If something doesn't pass muster or peer review, well, it gets discredited, doesn't it? That's because they want to control whole narratives. They want to control what the quote-unquote accepted science is. And this guy introduced that idea. Peer review. That's what this is. Okay? So we also see here that he introduced the idea of pooling everybody's salaries and redistributing them as needed. Socialism. Even though he had opposed the Bolsheviks in World War I, with these same ideologies, well, it seems he readily adopted them, didn't he? Something snapped in this guy's brain somewhere along the way, right? And, it became apparent here what the intent is by this time. So let's read on and see what else came about from all this. By the second half of the 1930s, Rees had put such vicious parlor games on a rigorous basis. While we intend to explore Reesian Psy-War theories in depth in the final section, it will be necessary to outline Rees's techniques here to prelude the discussion of his wartime activities. And I'm going to pause there. We're probably not going to get to the wartime activities aspect of this article because it is rather lengthy, unless I do maybe a part 2, which I might do. But we're going to see some of the methods that have been used here and how Tavistock does things. Many of these ideas adopted from Rees's ideology. Let's read on. As one of Rees's collaborators slyly put it, if J.R. Rees was not a giant in original contribution, he was certainly a man keenly and generously interested in applying the results of other people's work. Under Rees, the Tavistock Clinic pioneered work in abreaction theory using electroconvulsive shock and barbiturates. The clinical evidence from the deprogramming of Chris White indicated that the reversal of abreaction, the use of shock, hypnosis, and drugs to induce new, perhaps traumatic memories, is the technique needed to perform a first-class Pavlovian brainwashing job. Rees's praise for abreactive techniques remained boundless, and he later referred to abreaction with shock as being as effective as quote-unquote psychosurgery. And I'm going to pause there, folks. Do you know what abreaction is? This is inducing fear and trauma into the human mind. It's a type of initiation ritual. Going back to the old ancient mystery school teachings and the occult teachings again. You see how all this stuff always ties together, right? And he's saying that this works as effectively as psychosurgery in inducing behaviors in people, right? So he's suggesting that the use of terror and the fear motif to control people is one of the most effective ways to really, really change their behavior on a fundamental level. It's how you brainwash people. You get that? And if you manage to pull this off on a massive scale, well, then there's a huge number of minds that could be effective, right? Anyway, let's read on. This would also suggest why Rees recruited the young Eric Trist to Tavistock and quickly catapulted him into the highest echelons of that institution. Trist, presently head of the Tavistock operation on the east coast of the U.S., was picked up by Rees in 1940 while the former was researching drug and hypnosis-induced abreaction at an English hospital as a Rockefeller Foundation medical fellow. And I'm going to pause there. The time of this writing was 1974, so apparently this Eric Trist was still in charge over at Tavistock at that time. But you see, there's Rockefeller right there funding the whole thing, right? Let's read on. The other work that keenly and generously interested Rees was the then new developments in group therapy. It is clear that Rees exploited the work of W.R. Bion, whom Rees brought to Tavistock to personally supervise the group sessions that Rees made mandatory for all the staff for all its potential for manipulation. As a specialist in family welfare for the British government in the 1920s and 1930s, Rees had understood that the family was the most powerful psychoactive agent this side of electroshock. Indeed, in the so-called Rockefeller Memorandum of 1946, in which Rees offered the Tavistock Network to Rockefeller as his Psy-War brain trust, Rees's sales pitch revolved around the claim that the network was able to determine, quote, the relations of domestic and nursery culture to later political and economic behavior on a large scale, end quote. Bion's therapeutic groups provided the opportunity to tap the power of the family. And I'm going to pause there. Why are they always all about breaking up the family unit, folks? Well, here you go. Here's one of the reasons why. Not only is the family group the foundational start point of human culture, right? It's the whole tribalistic type idea. It's foundational to civilization, the family group, the core family. This was something that encapsulates different values in people, all right? Moral values. It gives people social archetypes, basically, all right? And this is foundational to human behavior. So if you break apart the family unit and create some of these disparities within, well, then that kind of fractures these archetypal thought processes in people, and they don't have that dynamic, that family dynamic, right? This is the foundational group, the family unit, the foundational group of how societies were built and modeled. Okay, this was the first society, so to say. Even, when you look back in ancient culture, and even today, These are usually people's first interactions with other people, is within family. And this is where lasting bonds and stuff are formed. If you break that apart, this has real psychological ramifications on people. And that's why they were so interested in delving into this whole psychiatric aspect of it, family. Right? Let's read on. A skilled group leader, even in the so-called leaderless variety, can use the group to create a powerful, albeit artificial, family environment. Once this environment is induced, it is possible for the therapist, for example, to manipulate a member of the group, not by a direct attack, but by subtly manipulating, with suggestions perhaps, the other members of the group. If the victim has been sucked into thinking of the group as something warm and helpful or motherly, then, when the environment has been manipulated to turn against him, it will tend to have the impact of deep motherly rejection. Furthermore, if the victim is not completely aware of the therapist's chain of manipulations, he will tend to internalize their result, thinking that he himself is responsible for this new awareness about himself. As we shall demonstrate later, the essence of Reesian Psywar techniques on a mass scale is to rely upon the selective manipulation of key factors in the environment, such that the individual tends to believe that the quote-unquote whole world is falling apart. And there is only himself to blame. Gonna pause there, folks. Let me read that again so you could understand. Look at the world today. Look at what's going on. Look at how we've been programmed to accept certain absurdities, right, in life, like, something to the effect of let's use an example here. Back in the 1800s, okay, it's largely accepted that many rich, wealthy, white plantation owners kept African slaves, right? So we're taught nowadays that we should be held accountable for that now. Things we didn't do, right? This is the type of absurdity I'm talking about as an example of this idea, right? You should be ashamed of yourself. It's your fault, see, that this happened. It's absurd on the face of it. And there should be reparations for this. Do you see the absurdity of this? Right? But these are the kinds of ideas that are indoctrinated into society, especially the very young people, the people in the school systems, okay? And Rockefeller plays a large part in the school systems too. Rees's ideas play part in the school system. All of these things interrelate. But let me read that again slowly for you so that you could really take apart that statement and understand what I'm talking about here. How we've been indoctrinated to believe that it's all our fault. The world's falling apart and it's all our fault. Look at the global warming thing too. It's all your fault. See, you're greedy. You go out, you run your car everywhere, you pollute, you throw garbage in the trash can and don't think anything more of it. It's your fault. Do you understand? Let me read it again now so you get the idea. As we shall demonstrate later, the essence of Reesian Psywar techniques on a mass scale is to rely upon the selective manipulation of key factors in the environment, such that individuals tend to believe that the whole world is falling apart, and there is only himself to blame. Did you catch all that? See? This is being done to us on purpose. You're being guilt-tripped into believing that it's all your fault. Because you're a piece of crap. That's how these people view you, right? This is the elitist mentality. This is what these psychopaths believe and think, and this is how they want to manipulate you. And this is their intent, okay? And it's based on a lot of the same belief systems and philosophies of this guy, John Rawlings Rees, okay? Tavistock has unprecedented reach into many policy-making groups in this world, all right? And these are the people, these are the same ideologies that have been specially, selectively cultivated through the years. And these are the types of people that they put into positions of power in these groups to push forward these ideas. And they manipulate the masses with these ideas. So this is what we're talking about. Anyway, let's continue on from where we left off. It will suffice for now to note that Rees understood through his group work that manipulation based upon bourgeois conception of the outside world as magical, what Marcus identified as mother's fears, was fundamental to mass control. Going to pause there for a minute. So what does he think is fundamental to mass control? Fear. Okay? Magical fear. Fear of things that aren't really there. What he calls mother's fears. Okay? This is fearing the worst case scenario all the time when there's no evidence of such a thing out there. Fear. Okay? This is fundamental to mass control. Remember that. That's what Rees said. It should be noted collaterally that Rees deeply cultivated his image as a warm, plump, smiling mother, as all of his devoted biographers portray him, especially in the mandatory group situations. Rees's incessant use of these techniques at all levels may explain the savage team spirit, not unlike that present in the CIA, of Rees's Tavistock collaborators. In any case, it is confirmed that Tavistock used these group techniques as the basis for their work against industrial workers. Gonna pause there. Once again, we're back to the idea of the destruction of the middle class, okay? And that's one of the main focuses of what's being said here in the article, all right? By 1938, Rees began to build his cabal in earnest, realizing that England was being put on a military footing and that the Army and the other fighting services form rather unique experimental groups since they are complete communities and it is possible to arrange experiments in a way that would be difficult in civilian life. And I'm going to pause there. Again, folks, do you hear another important facet of this? Rees suggested that because military units, all right, are a unique type of experimental group that doesn't have, say, the same kind of rights or obligations as the civilian class, that this group would be fantastic for experimenting on. You could thank Tavistock for that, folks. If you're a military member or you have family that's in the military and they've used all kinds of experimental vaccinations and all kinds of experimental types of treatments and everything on you, subjected you to all kinds of different things that you had no say over or no way to resist, you have Tavistock to thank for that. You have John Rawlings Rees to thank for that. That's who suggested this. Anyway, let's continue on, and we're going to wrap up here very soon. To seriously test its ideas in social control, Rees proposed Tavistock would simply have to take over the British Army. Rees's successful attempt at the takeover was so methodical that it is reproducible in a schematic form, and they actually have a chart here in the article that shows how he did it. Okay? So that's kind of interesting in and of itself. Rees used his connections with certain foremost sound men of finance, whom he had studiously flattered with honorary treasureships at Tavistock, to obtain the position of consulting psychiatrist to the Army at home in 1938, itself a somewhat honorific position with the Army Medical College carrying little power. It was no good being based in the Army Medical College, notes Rees. I had to be in the War Office itself, where I could have readier access to key people and to the Adjutant General's Department, which was concerned with manpower and other branches of central organization. How Rees gained entrance into the Adjutant Generalcy is illustrative of his scientific method, knowing from the honorary chairman of the Tavistock Council, Lord Alness, then Emergency Regional Commissioner for Scotland, that a certain Sir Ronald Adam was soon to be posted as Adjutant General. Rees had a close Tavistock associate, G.R. Hargreaves, bone up on medical history sufficient for bantering with the stodgy Adam. The impressed General Adam was then persuaded to take Hargreaves on as his command psychiatrist. Rees used his new leverage to have Adam create the Directorate of Army Psychiatry, which Rees ran through a transparent front man, Hugh Sandiford, an old Army buddy of Rees. Gonna pause right there, folks. You see that? They use front men and front groups to do things, but it's always the same people pulling the strings, right? Behind the scenes. So This way, they have a sort of plausible deniability about things, don't they? But we see how this has been set up, and this is the way they've done things for many, 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 many years now, right? It's always these same old tactics. Let's read on, and we're going to wrap it up here very soon. With 1 foot in the British General Staff, Rees began recruiting the hand-picked first squad of his cabal from around the Commonwealth. Rees demanded that the team meet regularly for informal sessions at which Rees and Bion were usually present. In characteristic Tavistock cover story style, a member of the quote-unquote invisible college, as Rees dubbed the team, described the course of the sessions. I'm going to pause for a second before we go through what this person said. He refers to it as the quote-unquote invisible college. This is a direct allusion to the secret society groups, okay? The Brotherhood, the Invisible College, the Order of the Quest, the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, all of it. All these secret society groups that tie all the way back to the ancient mystery schools. It's all the same thing, the Invisible College. Manly P. Hall referred in certain publications to some of these fraternal orders as the quote-unquote Invisible College, right? Rees took on this term to describe some of these people that he put in positions of power here. And it all relates, folks. Make no doubt about that. But let's read on what this member of the Invisible College said. Quote, "It was remarkable how, without my design, our interest seemed to shift from reporting on individual morbid conditions or cases to considering the larger problems of war and of human relations and nature of hostility, the state of civilization, which were to be very much reflected in the philosophy, first of the Army Psychiatric Service, and later on in our post-war planning and policies," end quote. So see, they roll these things out first within the confines of the military-industrial complex, and then they roll it out to the public, just like they do everything else, folks. What have I been telling you? Anyway, let's read on, and we'll wrap it up here. As our schematic shows, Rees deployed members of the quote-unquote Invisible College as command psychiatrists to the commanding officers of every major British Army unit. Rees relates with undisguised glee how his men overcame the anxiety of commanders who suddenly found medical men assigned to their staffs and in charge of the morale of their men. "I have no difficulties," said a corps general in Burma, who the Reesians had overcome. "If anything disturbing arises, I send my psychiatrist down there, and he puts it all right. He is one of the busiest men on my staff." The morale work of the college was largely a cover for the initial work in the areas to which they were assigned on the national ideologies that Rees had demanded as a preliminary for competent world selection. Throughout the war, Rees and his team pushed incessantly for selection techniques, and through his influence over General Adam and an increasing number of general officers, he was largely successful. By 1942, Rees had induced the British General Staff and the War Office to begin an experimental War Office selection board to screen a small number of officer candidates. While the board was nominally run by regular Army officers, both of whom, incidentally, began to go to Invisible College meetings, Tavistockers held firm control, including Bion, a tank officer in the First War, J.D. Sutherland, and young Rocky Trist. By late that year, the experimental board became the Research and Training Center as War Office selection boards proliferated throughout England and the rest of the Commonwealth. Almost all the boards included heavy Tavistock representation. By the end of the war, most British officer candidates and many enlisted men had their psychological profiles noted by Reesian psychiatrists in the boards. And I'm going to pause for a second here, folks. This was all going on during World War II. Rees really stepped into a position where he took a major role in the development of this intelligence logistics network within World War II. And some of this was referred to as quote-unquote operations research. Do we remember back from the episode we did on the Quiet War, reading from Silent Weapons from Quiet Wars, where many of the cybernetics ideologies came from? from what's called logistics or what's called operations research during World War II. And this was one of the methodologies used. And Rees had a major role in that as far as the logistics of controlling people groups, right? So this is one of the things referred to. And a lot of this is precursor ideas to what was later named the cybernetics approach to things. And cybernetics, for those who don't know, I'm not referring to, like, say, robotics and things like that, although that has certainly become a part of it. Cybernetics originally is defined as the science of whole systems control. Okay? So think of it in those terms. Cybernetics is the science of whole systems control. It's all about controlling and manipulating whole systems. Okay? That's what the cybernetics approach is, and many of these cybernetics ideas were born out of this research right here. And, these ideas put forth by Rees and others. But let's continue on. In Canada, Rees's selection techniques were made universal under the Canadian Army Director of Personnel, Brigadier Brock Chisholm, a close personal friend of Rees. Go figure, right? Chisholm, later to be the first Director General of the UN's World Health Organization. Let me repeat that, folks. This good friend of Rees, Chisholm, later became the first Director General of the UN's World Health Organization, was also the first to implement Rees's idea that infantry squads should be grouped by intelligence. Chisholm's and Rees's work in Canada was successful enough for Rees to later hope that perhaps the Canadian reception centers stand out as the most interesting foretaste of what might be done in civilian life. Rees used every possibility to extend and deepen the hegemony of selection. As the war ground down after 1944, Rees began shifting personnel from the selection boards to another of his projects, the Civil Resettlement Scheme. With the resettlement scheme, Rees began testing what he hoped selection might lead to. All English prisoners of war returning from liberated POW camps in Europe were ordered to volunteer for a short stay in centers staffed exclusively by Tavistockers before being discharged. In addition to having their psychological profiles typed, these men underwent Bion's group therapy, where suggestions were made as to where each should live and what line of work each should take up. Aftercare was provided to monitor if the suggestions were followed. Rees planned to have the scheme expanded to all returning Army personnel under the aegis of the Ministry of Labor, but with the end of the war and the new Labor Party government, his influence waned, a lesson that Rees would not forget, and that program was scrapped. But I'm going to pause there, folks. This was debriefing, okay? He debriefed people, and this all has to do with things like post-traumatic stress disorder, see? He had people psychologically manipulated, in a sense, after the war because of this post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Anyway, let's continue on. We're almost to the end of what we're going to do here tonight. Rees's British resettlement work, though mildly undemocratic, looks hardly ominous. The nature of Reesian selection and resettlement as a control function is more striking in Tavistock's work on the German ideology. Rees himself took up the German work in earnest in 1940 when he was invited to head the psychiatric examination of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy Führer for the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. And I'm going to pause there, folks. You hear that? This guy worked for intelligence, MI6, British intelligence, and he was working with the Germans and studying the Germans, right? Let's read on. Rees, not without irony, Rees notes that his patient's ideology stemmed from his university study of the very race science and geopolitical theories that had so shaped Rees himself. Gonna pause there. Did you hear that? He had the same teachings and ideologies as these Germans, as Hess, okay? Hess, though definitely insane by this time, was dimly aware of his doctor's proclivities. The ghostwriter of Hitler's theory book, Mein Kampf, Hess pleaded that Brigadier Rees was the only psychiatrist who understood him. The Special Operations Executive, the section of British intelligence in charge of clandestine operations, was sufficiently impressed with Rees's work that there began after 1940 a close working relationship between the Tavistock crew and the Special Operations Executive H.V. Dix, Rees's aide-de-camp at Tavistock and assistant on the Hess case, was seconded to the Directorate of Military Intelligence on a semi-permanent basis. Gonna pause there. So you see, Rees had this guy set up in military intelligence. Do you see how these tentacles kind of go out and get placed in various places of power? Anyway, let's read on. It was through Dix that Reesian methods of selection and of psychological warfare became hegemonic in the American Office of Strategic Services and eventually in all allied psychological warfare and intelligence planning bodies. And I'm going to pause there, folks, and I think we're actually going to stop right there. Do you know what the Office of Strategic Services was? This was the precursor of the CIA. So, this being the case, this is how Rees got these ideas and his tentacles put in place within the American intelligence community. And this is why Rockefeller is all so ingratiated within the intelligence community and the CIA as well. You see, all these different facets of this grand conspiracy coming together. This is what Rees attempted to do. He wanted to get people in these positions of power here. We'll continue on just a little bit more before we call it quits here, because there's a couple more important ideas. Let's read on. What is of importance is that Rees used military intelligence to further his selection techniques through the SOE, as it were, the Special Operations Executive. Rees had units called British Collecting Centers attached to German POW camps in Britain and Canada. Using the original work done on Hess, Dix, who commanded the centers, developed a set of psychiatric criteria to screen incoming prisoners. While the centers did perform their nominal function of gathering data to be later used in propaganda against German troops, Dix's actual purpose was to test the control aspect of the selection criteria. Dix used his system to select out weak ego types, who were then subjected to Bion-style group indoctrination. The best were parachuted back into Germany as agents of this group here. The rest were used as informers and operators to maintain control of the rest of the POWs for the British. So you see how he used these German groups, these different German troops, POWs, how they did a psychiatric evaluation of them, determined who had a quote-unquote weak ego that they could manipulate, and they used them as double agents and sent them back. See what's been done, how intelligence communities have operated in many ways here? Let's read on. The collecting centers were themselves only a test phase for the work military intelligence would later perform at the selection center in Bad Oeynhausen in the British zone of occupied Germany. Advised by Dix and commanded by Colonel Dick Rendell, a longtime member of the Invisible College at Tavistock, the selection center used denazification as the cover to pick non-Nazi future leaders and administrators among Germans. I'm going to repeat that. The selection center used denazification as the cover to pick non-Nazi future leaders and administrators among Germans. Very important ideas here, folks. We must assume that by 1947, British intelligence and its American counterpart had Reesian psychological profiles of most, if not all, potential political and trade union leaders of the post-war generation of Germans. What shaping went on at the center and who the informants were is not yet known, but a major Labor Committee research project has been launched in this area, which, when the details are clear, should make for an interesting rewrite of German post-war history. And we're going to stop right there, folks. German post-war history. What do we know about that? Well, wasn't there Operation Paperclip, where the Americans and the Russians both imported some of these Nazi scientists, right? And put them in positions of power and authority and gave them lots of backing and money to do certain things. And what did we just see here? So we could see here that they were all profiled, and they were put into positions where they could become future leaders and administrators of different things. And these people were all handpicked and manipulated by Tavistock and these other groups that worked along with them and put into positions of authority. This is how these people operate, okay? And we're going to call it quits right there for tonight. And I think maybe I'll read through the rest of this and see what other pertinent details are there. And we might do a part 2. But the general premise here is this is how Tavistock has come about, and how it does things, and how it's become a major player in the social engineering of the world, and how it puts people in positions of power. So there's a little history lesson for all you folks there. Tavistock. If you haven't looked into Tavistock, look into it. If you haven't heard of John Rawlings Rees, look him up. These are foundational things for what's been going on in society now. And we could see how this quiet war has been engineered in this way, right? And how we are still in the confines of it. And it's a different kind of war, right? It's not traditional warfare like you would think of, like World War II was. It's actually something much different. It's a type of psychological operation of sorts. It's how they term it, a quiet war, essentially, isn't it? It's a war against the public by the elite class of this world. And it's done in a way that is not perceived by the vast majority of the population. Anyway, folks, thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you next time. I hope you have an excellent night.
Come with me. Got something to say. Might show about to wait. Think something new deep inside of you. Something on your mind. Something you want to find. Another path, another light. A peace in your sight. Come with me out to sea. Raise the sail and feel a wind so free. Come with me. We'll plan to save. Take the time and you'll get what you need. Got a hungry mind. There is lots for us to find. 1,000 steps to take today. what can make